Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us here this afternoon. And I apologize for we're starting just a couple of minutes late. That's kind of the order of the day, I think, around here. Kamal was so generous with his time, and we scheduled this months ago, and now we're all sort of scrambling around with what's going on in the world. So thank you for everyone's patience. We're joined today by Kamal Abu-Shamsieh, who is the director of the Interreligious the Interreligious program. You can correct me on the title there at GTU. And we're really excited to hear a little bit more about CPE and spiritual care education more broadly than just the United States. This is a real growth field in lots of ways, and so we're excited to hear more. Trace Haythorn, who is the executive director of ACPE, is going to kick us off with a little bit of kind of his perspective on what this looks like from the United States perspective, and then Kamal, we will hand it off to you. So thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Kamal. It's good to be with you both. And quite honestly, it's a delight to talk about something else. So thank you all for joining us today. It's been an exciting couple of years as we've begun to look at what's happening globally in spiritual care. And I really want to give credit to some of our folks from the Academy that have been pushing hard at looking at particularly the critical lens of Western imperialism and colonialism, the way that we have often from the United States gone into places to show them how they should do things, rather than coming in with a much more appreciative lens and exploring and learning from each other in cooperative ways that really help build the capacities for spiritual care around the world. Over the last couple of years, I've had the unique opportunity, both through ACPE and through some partnership with the George Washington Institute for Spirituality and Health with Christina Pilhowski, to be looking at what's happening out there and what are the ways that we can connect. Kamal will talk a little bit about this as well, but one of the things that we've identified within ACPE is really 3 different levels of engagement. These are broad clustered groups, if you will. But there are places that have little to no history of chaplaincy. They don't recognize that term. Their understanding of any kind of spiritual care has been directly connected to the faith tradition of a group, a particular religious tradition, and the leaders in those traditions would be the ones that would provide spiritual care in times of crisis. The second group are folks that are aware of chaplaincy, but it's never quite become a formal profession, or it's maybe there's some people who volunteer in a chaplain-like role, but again, not necessarily a profession that is funded and supported by institutions. And then that third level is that full integration, where people are actually paid by institutions to serve in a pastoral or spiritual care role. There's an integrated sense within the larger culture of what this role is and why we have them. We've had some great experiences in the last few years looking at sort of a pan-Southeast Asian conversation that has been coordinated by some of our colleagues in Honolulu. Anka Floor's work with the Pacific Health Ministry, some of it dates back decades. ACP has worked for a long time with a number of centers in Hong Kong and has worked to help train some of the supervisors who are there. There's a strong Christian ethos to what's happening there, which I think also echoes some of the history of ACPE. It's very different than some of the other groups that we've begun to work with. There's a Japanese project that is has a strong Buddhist influence, but not a singular Buddhist influence. So it represents many of the different forms of Buddhism that are out there. Those folks are already talking about CPE and the training of chaplains. So they're kind of at that third stage, if you will, really looking at that level. In the middle tier group, there are colleagues around the world who've been good conversation partners. It feels like we've had the opportunity to walk with some folks in Santiago, Chile, where they have moved from that first level, if you will, into this second level. They're now training volunteers. They have people that actually want to come to the States to do CPE, or they want to ultimately begin to develop their own CPE model within a Santiago, Chilean context. There are also some other folks from around Chile now that would like it to go beyond Santiago. That entry level are places where there's just not been much of an experience or knowledge of this. Or it has been prohibited because it's been limited to a particular tradition. And that's some of what I think Kamal can talk about within Malaysia, where there was already a CPE organization, but it was working primarily with Christians. The other thing that is really powerful in all of this is the language that we use to talk about what this work is all about. Widely recognized, chaplain's got very strong Christian roots to it. So is it another form of imperialism to continue to use that terminology? On the other hand, what do we call the act that people are engaged in? Pastoral care fits for some traditions and not others. Spiritual care seems like it may be broader and more welcoming of some of the other traditions. But in some places, some of our Southeast Asian conversations and even in Malaysia, the concern around using spiritual is that it was particularly related to animists, and that was offensive to the more dominant religious groups. So it really seems like St. Francis's ideas about preaching at all times and when necessary use words, we would modify that to say care at all times and when necessary use words, because of just the complexities of these international boundaries and models. It's easy to find places around the world where chaplaincy is very well developed and a part of the culture. It's harder to find where the commonalities are between those different types of chaplaincy around the world. And so part of what Kamal and I have been talking about in the work with Malaysia is how do we let this grow to be a Malaysian thing? And what can we learn back in the US about how we might approach not just Muslim communities, but spiritual care in general because of those experiences? So with that as kind of a broad overview, let me hand it to Kamal and let him talk a little bit more about that project and some of the other pieces he's been working on.
Well, thank you, Trace, and thank you, Michael, and thanks to the Innovation Chaplaincy Lab for the leadership at this critical time. Indeed, it's a welcoming departure temporarily from talking about COVID-19 to talk about what's the future ahead. And for those who wants to plan for opportunities, this is a perfect opportunity to look at expansion of spiritual care beyond the boundaries of the United States, and also to look at it in a outside of the Christian format. And in this case, language does matter and terms do matter, and what we describe things might be inviting and might be a turn off for some communities. I started my international journey, which I'm still going through that journey, on January 1st, 2013. There was a conference in Saudi Arabia in Riyadh, and I was doing CPE at the time with George Fitzgerald, the former director of spiritual care. He was invited to give a history of spiritual care, and I joined into that conference, and certain things just opened up. One of the findings from the interactions and from speaking with chaplains there, as well as physicians and leaders, that there is a great interest in spiritual care. What is it? Not much idea of how we define it, but there is such interest in it. It's the connection, the spirituality and religion are synonymous, intertwined, and there is the debate of can we have religious support without spirituality, or can we have spirituality without religion? That is still a debate that is unsettling there or not settled. The services that I found everyone is talking about from an Islamic perspective, it's a Sharia based. That means in order to offer spiritual care, you have to go through the legal and the ethical theory of Islam. Without that, it is completely not acceptable, including care for Muslims and care for non-Muslims. On the other hand, I found a clear foundation of spiritual care in Islam. So when we're talking about terms like pastoral care, I came across a narrative in the prophetic narrative and the tradition. The sources of Islam will start with the Quran, and then we move into the Hadith, the sayings and practical tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And he said, all of you, or each one of you, is a pastor, is a shepherd. Each one of you is a shepherd and responsible for the flock, which is echoing exactly what you have in Christian terms. كلكم راع, each one of you is a shepherd. So when we look at shepherding, when we look at being with, everything that we have been building on from a spiritual care in Christian perspective is already there in Muslim perspective. So in that case, my recommendation is to keep the term pastoral. And when it get to there is to define it within the communities and to give them the ownership of it, to define it as they build their competencies and they build on how you can support it from their sources. So second thing I found out that it is based on rituals, because it's specific to environments. For example, in Saudi Arabia in particular, it's gender specific or separated. And also in most of the countries that I have visited, it is literally limited to business hours from 8 to 5. After hours, there are no chaplains available, and we fall back on the traditional role for nurses to calm down and to comfort patients. So chaplains are nowhere to be seen. On the specifics of their work, I found out that chaplains don't have access to medical records, so they don't chart, they don't write notes, they don't get any consults from physicians. And also they lack methodology of triaging, which patient to see first, or is there a system for that? So that was lacking. And most of those who are here to work in, to offer spiritual care, which in many places they refer to it as religious support to patients, have grounding or received education, theological education, but none of them have any clinical experience. So they are scholars in their own rights, yet they are not trained to put that scholarship and the theology in the context of, for example, end of life. And they found themselves there, the first entry to it is jurisprudence or the legal issues in terms of how to deal with illness. Every hospital I visited in Pakistan, I visited in Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, Indonesia. Every hospital has a mosque, a place for prayers. So the chaplain functions as the imam of the hospital. That means the duties are not 100% dedicated to patients and taking care of patients' needs. So you have pastoral duties around the 5 daily prayers. You have education for staff, religious education that we don't do here in the United States. So there is religious education for staff. There is the holidays, which we work on these things. So they're aim basically on the services. I summarize it in about 10 words or 10 goals. First one is to comfort patients, offer companionship, offer support to patients by offering good news, assurances, strengthening, teaching, reminding, directing, and influencing. So you find a broad range of elements. Some of it is patient-centered by journeying and offering and helping, but the other part is the goal is to influence the patient. So the chaplain coming at it from an authority perspective, that means providing ways to say, you have a terminal illness, so it is counterproductive to show lack of patience. So it's a religious duty in this case to show patience because that's what the normative source is telling us to do so. I'm making a general statement here, but in most of the places I found out that there are those elements of interactions. There is approaches to coping and to assessment that they found. Some of them is negative, identifying what is a negative coping and what I define as positive coping. So elements of fear and anger and sadness is considered, in their opinion, a negative approach. So the job of the chaplain there is to change that. So the element of directing and authority, in this case, in my opinion, what we try to do is to change that. So how we work to change that, I took different approaches to share what we have been teaching here or what I learned in my spiritual care journey here at Stanford Hospital and at community hospitals as well. So we started by teaming, and the strategy was for Muslim communities worldwide. I teamed up with physicians. So the Federation of Islamic Medical Associations is one of the partners of my organization, Muslim Spiritual Care, known by the term ziyara, which means to visit. So Ziyara teamed up with the Federation of Islamic Medical Association, which has chapters in 40 Muslim majority countries or communities, including here in the United States. Imana is one of the strongest chapters of FEMA. And when I joined in FEMA, I joined it as a spiritual care consultant. Every chapter basically has an annual convention, sometime every 2 years. So they started to issue invitations for me to join and to share the concept of spiritual care. We found out the second strategy after teaming with physicians to bring physicians as champions of spiritual care is where is the entry, where we introduce spiritual care as a service in the hospitals. I found out that palliative care and end-of-life care is the most appropriate and needed beginning to introduce spiritual care. Muslims in their daily prayers pray for a concept that we call husn al-khatima, which is literally praying for a good ending, a good death perspective. So that is part of the theology of Islam, is to connect this life with the hereafter and praying for a good ending. A good ending is modeled after the death experience of the Prophet Muhammad, where someone will affirm the unity of God, affirm the principles of Islamic monotheism and belief, and that is a good ending. For that, a chaplain, or not just a chaplain, it's a collective responsibility on Muslims worldwide, is to coach the dying person to affirm faith and the promise or the good news that whoever is affirming that as an end-of-life ritual will be rewarded by entering the gardens or heaven. So for this, to have a chaplain who is trained to offer this end-of-life service became of utmost significance to physicians and to faith leaders. In order to make that a more formal way, we teamed up with local community organizations in Indonesia. I presented this model to the National Sharia Board of Indonesia, which look at it as similar to the Joint Commission here in the United States. It accredits hospitals, primarily Sharia-based hospitals, and they gave me an endorsement to train Indonesian chaplains to offer end-of-life care. To branch out of that service, we look at a chaplain who I asked the question, do you have non-Muslims in your communities, and how do you offer spiritual care? And that was a major obstacle to their work. They identified that as, we don't know what to do with them. So the unfortunate reality is there is an active pastoralization in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, and that's literally counterproductive to the work of spiritual care. So they invite the person, for example, to join in through a prayer or active pastoralization, and that will be the scope of work. So we try to change that. And the way we change that approach, and it worked in the countries that have been working, is by identifying the Islamic concept of the mission of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was mercy for humankind, was not a mission of hope only for Muslims. So when we identify Rahmah lil Alameen, mercy for humankind, it brought every soul created by God under that umbrella. So that aspect of companionship, aspect of comforting was extended. So those who were trained dropped that fear of what to do, and the only way I can do it out of care and love for this person, and to invite him to join my faith, now becoming, let's understand what your needs are. So I'll stop here for a minute to allow for breathing and for others who would like to ask questions, including Michael and Trace and the participants as well.
Thanks, Kamal. Michael, do you want us to just jump into the questions?
Yeah, I think that's probably the best place to start, and that'll probably spin off some other questions as well. You know, a lot of this has to do with you know, experiences that we just don't necessarily have in the United States, but some of them are. So I'm interested to see how there's some overlap here. One question: how does religious pluralism impact our CPE or chaplaincy experiences? And I think if I can sort of extrapolate that question, what is the difference between pluralism here, where most people that are on this webinar have done CPE, and pluralism elsewhere, and how can we kind of reframe our way of seeing this question?
That's a great question, and challenging too. One of the things that we've tried to do in some of our interactions with the international programs where we've made connections is to not have people to function in a pluralistic way that fits our paradigm, if you will. So the one place where we invite people into an exploration is, what does it mean to believe what you believe so deeply that you can be open to whatever someone else brings? And what does that mean within your own culture to be in that place? Is that an acceptable place? What are the challenges of being in that place? Rather than saying that that's the way you should be. It's an invitation to explore that dynamic. And one of the things we've been trying to do across a number of different partnerships is really help the World Health Organization expand their definition of health beyond the three pillars of physical, emotional, and social health to include spiritual health. And interestingly enough, the push for that spiritual health is coming from the two-thirds world. That's not coming from the United States. That's coming from people in what have been traditionally labeled developing countries, where the understanding of the spiritual dimensions of life are still much more integrated and less cognitively managed than what you would find in the US. So our hope is that we can really begin to build this out so that people do see spirituality as a core component of health. And thus, every person we meet in vulnerable places have these resources already within them to engage in what wellness, what care, what they are seeking in terms of their own fullness of life.
The only addition to that is, if we are to go back to our common values, those are the universal values found in every religion and in every theology. The approach to it is different, the understanding of it is different, and in this case, difference is not a conflict. So acknowledging that we are different and acknowledging the uniqueness of each one's faith, that to me as a Muslim, believing in this is as the true path to salvation should not be undermining your own beliefs. And I might disagree with how you interpret it, but still that separation. We have a tendency to try to unite everyone under the same understanding, and we should move away from it because it's counterproductive.
Yeah, it's that metaphor of we're not looking for a stew, we're looking for a buffet, a salad bar, if you will. That the distinctive particularities are all part of what make the human condition so rich and so beautiful. I think that the other part of that I'd want to add is thinking about this language piece as well. When a culture picks up language that is not theirs and tries to use that language, are they appropriating it or are they repurposing it? And I often think that depends on who's doing it and what their intentions are in doing it. Appropriation often has a lack of respect for the culture from which the languages come. And so it is simply a way of adding some spice to what's already your thing. Where some repurposing is, like Kamal was describing in Malaysia, coming to understand what's the intention behind this use of the word pastoral, and where are there examples of that within the Muslim tradition? Where does the Quran speak of this? And how could it be understood in a way that's culturally appropriate? So that, again, there's always going to be some tension simply because language can never fully carry all that we mean within it. Mm-hmm. So finding ways to enrich and deepen those conversations, I think, is a really beautiful part of the international interactions that we've had.
I hope during the next half an hour that we have, that will be some time to share some pictures with you, because sometimes seeing what we're talking about in picture worth 1,000 words, and maybe it will clarify something that we're talking about, but we'll field some of the questions as well.
Trace, I want to, since we have a fair amount of time, I'm going to follow up on what Trace just said with a little bit of a question on my own, and that's the question of language. I'm wondering what we actually do to this field when we think about those other parts of the world as the developing world, which implies there is an end state that they are working to get towards. Now, what do we expect? Do we expect that whenever they reach that end state, that their religious and spiritual demographic is going to look just like ours? Because that assumes that we have reached some sort of endpoint that everyone else is trying to get to as well, where religion and spirituality play a much different role in society than they do in parts of the world that Kamal is much more familiar with. I think that we have to be very mindful of that, and that when we think about whatever we want to call it, chaplaincy, spiritual care, pastoral care, in other parts of the world, we can't think of it as, well, we'll just sort of adopt this mindset for now, but eventually in a generation or two, they'll do it just like us because we've, come so far, or whatever it is. I think that's a real danger. And maybe it's just my own fear, but I certainly wouldn't want to, for that to happen.
Yeah, I think that's some of the history that we've had to learn from. We've had people in that classic old maxim who have paved a lot of roads with good intentions, and those roads don't lead to the places they intended. I think we're part of what we're having to learn, and I'll speak especially for the United States right now, is a kind of new cultural humility, especially in this time that I'm not saying that we're demonstrating it well, but I think that there is an understanding. There's a reason why a lot of countries, a lot of faith communities in a lot of countries very far away from here are sending missionaries to the U.S. because of how far they think we've gone. So that's an interesting part of the conversation that we've had with people along the way too.
Now, in to answer that from a Muslim perspective, in countries where I visited, it brought to my attention in Saudi Arabia when I described what chaplaincy is, when we talk about journeying and being with and companionship. One of the scholars shared that in the 6th century, that's before CPE, before ACPE was created, there was a legal entity created after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And in that legal trust, employees would be working to offer comforting to patients. So part of the responsibility or the qualification is to have beautiful voice, because after the hours, you'll be singing melodies and chanting religious chants in the middle of the night in the hospital. And they will be offering what we call placebo to patients, that they will be coming to talk about the patient. Two people will talk about the patient and say, did you hear what the doctor say about Michael this morning? So Michael, who is a patient, will hear his name and will become more interested in what's happening. And these two people will say, well, I heard that he's doing just fine and might go to home fairly soon. So that's their understanding of offering the good news was in this 6th century. So to look at it from what it will look like to have those universal values of the art of chaplaincy and spiritual care, and to give it to every community to take ownership. Number one, let them dig into their sources. In this case, in the Muslim community, in the Quran and in the Hadith and in the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, to look for examples. So one of the examples that we found is his wife Khadija acted as the first Muslim female chaplain in history by comforting him, by providing him with the support he asked for, presenting his good quality as a father figure, and to say, God will not let you down. I don't have the answer for what you're asking me. Let's go ask my cousin who's a Christian, who understands these theological elements that you're talking about. So together, she facilitated this meeting with her cousin who's Christian, and he answered the questions of the Prophet Muhammad, who did not know at the time that those are signs of prophethood. So when we presented that in the culture and the context of Muslim communities, they immediately understood what we're talking about. So this invitation is for us to be a little bit more humble in our approach, that we are not the ones who know every aspect of how to offer care, but to come at it with the curiosity is, this is what we have as an idea of care. Does this resonate with some of your sources? And if it does, what does it mean? And how to offer it and how to reach that end goal together of comforting of our patients.
There is a great question that I think continues this thread of what we're talking about. This person says, I'm curious to hear more about what we're doing when we're doing spiritual care and how spiritual care differs from another discipline. They mentioned clinical psychology, but this is a conversation that comes up sometimes in the American context. What does a chaplain do that a social worker doesn't do, or a counselor, or whatever? And so some effort has to be made sometimes to differentiate what those tasks are. Is there a similar conversation operating in other parts of the world? And do the answers to those questions in other places, can that help inform what we're doing here?
I found it firsthand in Saudi Arabia to compare chaplaincy with social work. Yes, there is an overlap, and we all know that there is overlap between social work and chaplaincy. But from a career perspective, social work is recognized as a career in Saudi Arabia. Chaplaincy is not recognized as a career. So in doing what we're doing, we have to pitch it not just in terms of what we do, is how to get there. What are the qualifications? What is the educational track? And is this educational track compatible? Can they have, for example, a chaplaincy program in Muslim majority countries that is recognized by our organizations? Can they seek board certification so they can be supported? So, and the second one is, how can we help people by bringing them for CPE or clinical pastoral education or training so they can build the scholarship in their own countries? To this day, the organization that classifies employment has not literally gave its green light to accept chaplaincy as a career, and that continues to be for us as an obstacle, because once we want to train, we want to have people to succeed. So, for example, at the Graduate Theological Union, where I work as director of Interreligious Chaplaincy, you want to train chaplains so they can be employed. And if we train people and we cannot promise them in Saudi Arabia or Malaysia or other countries that they will be employed, what are we doing?
That's a very practical question, Kamal, and I think that many other organizations could learn a great deal from that. When you mentioned implementing CPE and having difficulty getting this recognized as a profession, this is almost the exact question that someone just asked, but maybe you could go into a little bit more detail. Where have you found pushback when trying to introduce the concept of CPE, and on what basis is the resistance made?
The resistance, the first thing, there is always the naysayers, which something, we don't need this. This is from the West. We have everything we need. We've got that in every community. The question that we need to ask ourselves is CPE is the only model that we can offer spiritual care? Does every chaplain need to have a CPE? And to me, my humble approach is no. We need to bring people to an understanding of spiritual care. So that's where we started. We started with teaching of the concepts, and not only to chaplains, because chaplains don't function alone. Today they are, but we changed that in Malaysia by reaching out to physicians, to hospital administrators, to nurses. They came on board. We introduced a half unit, and thanks to Trace and the Association for Clinical Pastoral Education, they granted Ziara a $9,000 grant that will go towards CPE. We brought in 12 students. 4 of them are physicians, including psychiatrists, nurses, and 4 chaplains. So this interdisciplinary group went through CPE, just graduated last Friday from this program, and they are operating in 7 different hospitals. So the idea, CPE, or this understanding of spiritual care, is not just limited to faith leaders. It has to be a culture. So with this, I commend Trace, what is working with Dr. Christina Pachaski in terms of bringing in an understanding of spirituality to physician, not just an understanding and championship and introduction of spirituality as part of clinical work. So that is the paradigm that we need to reach and to work support.
Yeah, I think the other dynamic that's taking place globally, there are some really important questions that are being raised because of some significant sociological transitions that are happening within countries. So, for example, the work we were doing in Chile, just prior to our arrival there was a team from Chile who came to the States just to visit and see what this was and to see how all of this operated. By the time we took a team back down to Santiago, the Archbishop of Chile had asked for the resignations of all of the bishops within the Catholic Church because of the sexual abuse scandal and the deep sense of pain of not having responded well to that. The data when we arrived there showed this sudden spike in people, particularly young people in the country, who identified as spiritual but not religious. And what was interesting is they still were using a lot of their Catholic practices and rites. They just weren't doing it in the church. And so one of the things that they were looking for is, what does religious leadership mean for us in light of this now? And so we're asking for a model that fits very well within the world of chaplaincy. And in fact, some of them wanted to come and begin training to become chaplains and to bring that back home again, out of a concern that the models that had been so important and so dominant for so long will no longer hold. And if that's the case, then what are some alternatives that still make sure that the spiritual care needs of the people are addressed? It's a kind of a lovely, I think, non-reactive and compassionate approach to the development of spiritual care as a profession within a particular culture.
Trace, you mentioned the South American example specifically, and there are several of these questions have brought up that very large region. Religious conflict is almost endemic around the world, but especially in South America, the intertwining of religious and ethnic identity is so long that this presents another level as well. I'm going to sort of cut across a number of the questions here and ask Kamal, where have you seen this play out in your efforts to promote chaplaincy, and how can chaplains grapple with that when the question of spirituality and religion goes even deeper than an individual's beliefs and into a very long history of identity beyond faith?
Absolutely. In every country I visited, unfortunately, there is the mistrust coming at, thanks to the missionaries who have been going there to change the faith of communities and played a negative role in introducing Christianity in particular. So I find mistrust in Indonesia, mistrust in Saudi Arabia, in Malaysia. As Trace mentioned, there is already a group that is working to bring CPE into Malaysia, and they have been facing obstacles from higher ups in terms of operating inside of hospitals because of fear of parcelization. So in this sense, it makes sense to develop more than one track, more than one approach, one within the same faith environment, and for communities to have their own understanding and approach, and then try to bridge that by bringing in a pilot program similar to the one that we brought. We opened it up to all faith communities. Unfortunately, in the end, we only had 12 individuals who are Muslim, not because we wanted that way, because part of the other obstacle is time commitment.
Yeah.
Time to take to be in a CPE program. Cost is another factor in terms of we're looking at countries that cannot basically put the amount necessary to bring a supervisor from the US to train them. So in this case is literally how can we demonstrate trust, build the confidence, and this will be a locally fostered environment. It cannot be imposed on these communities from the US or other places.
Yeah.
So literally we have to invest in building the alliances locally. In my last visit to Indonesia in February, I was with members of the National Sharia Board and introduced an ACPE graduate who completed her work in Hong Kong, and she's a Christian. I said, we do have a local professional whom personally I know, and they said, we will admit, we will bring that, and we will cooperate. If you say this person is good, we'll work with that person. I'm not saying my word will be enough. I'm saying it comes to as look at inner circles, build alliances. We have been working on this field personally for the past 7 years. So after this, we start to empower the local organizations. After they found out that they do have the need, they do have an understanding of what spiritual care, it becomes the question, who is going to do it?
Yeah.
So we're looking at what capacity can we offer them. In this case, what kind of exchange of information and scholarship and grants, and can we bring people who can be with us for a while in the US? If we can take the education to them, we'll bring some of them as well.
Yeah. I'm gonna pull a question out of the chat box instead of the Q&A box, so you may not have seen it yet, but I think this is a really important point. This person says, is it reasonable to say that non-denominational approaches to spiritual and religious care, where doctrine may be subordinated to the need for the most inclusion and embrace of the human spirit, is that kind of approach driving change to the faith and spiritual character of the entire sort of society or community? In other words, are we moving away from pretty bold lines to maybe a little bit more blur? And is that where things are going? Or have you seen things much different on the ground as you travel?
I personally saw things differently. I think trying to minimize the role of deeply held beliefs and theologies will be counterproductive. I had an exercise with Malaysian chaplains as well as Saudi chaplains in terms of taking care of non-Muslims. In Saudi Arabia, they have about 8 million people who are non-Muslims working and living there. And I said, let's just look at the individual for a second, and we start literally dissecting the individual from an Islamic perspective. Is this a soul that God created? Yes. Is this worthy of being respected based on the Quranic understanding? Yes. So we start going through everything, and they were affirmative of everything. At the end, they said, but we cannot offer a Christian prayer, or we cannot pray for them for this particular thing. I said, well, you don't have to. Part of our work is facilitation. Can you facilitate that? And so the idea is, no, religion is very important to individuals, and it's very important to patients. So the approach is not to move away. The approach is to find ways that we can both engage the traditions and honor the diversity as well, including diversity within the same faith. Because often people look at it that people are, just because you're a Muslim, you have to believe this way, or that's the only way approach to it. I've been kicked out of patients' room primarily by Muslims in the past 10 years than anybody else.
Yeah, I probably have a different lens as well, partially coming from the sociological side of these questions. I think historically, religion has been embodied institutionally, and the advancement of a particular faith or a particular faith perspective was as much about advancing the institution as it was anything else.
Yeah.
Today, we're in a place where there are resources of these wonderfully rich traditions that inform the ways that we provide care, and that it is less important to bring the institutional framework to somebody as it is to help them resource the spiritual tools that they may or may not even be familiar with from their own tradition, that they may not even know are a part of where they've come from. And thus the chaplain's job is to help them access or grow, learn, connect to those resources in a way that serves, again, then towards their greater wellness or greater wholeness.
Yeah. Trace, I'm reminded of a wonderful story that I'm sure lots of folks have heard or have seen or whatever, so it's not necessarily unique, but of the Muslim chaplain who is helping a Christian woman in the hospital whose baby has just died. And the woman says, I was going to baptize this baby, but now this has happened. You're the chaplain. Can you baptize the baby? And of course he says, well, I cannot do that, not because I don't want to, but because this just doesn't make sense. What I can do is gather all of the materials that you need to do it yourself and show you how to do it, and you can carry this out. So this is a moment where religious tradition is very much respected, and a moment of growth for this woman as well, who was previously unaware that this is something that she herself as a member of this community could do. I think that decoupling that kind of belief from the institutions, while maybe not necessary, can certainly advance, maybe a greater encounter than otherwise if we're just going to fall back on the institutions.
Having lost a child myself, an infant, I know how difficult it will be. And I have made it exactly similar approach that I personally cannot baptize for religious reasons. I would always ask the mother of the baby just to keep that baby on her chest, and if she would consider baptizing her own child. And I will teach, I will facilitate, similar for end of life support for Catholic, for adults when a priest is not available. and some might not be the ritual that can be offered. If it's the understanding that must be only by a priest, I would ask people to consider anointing their own loved one. If that's something they would like to have, I will facilitate. So the idea is we're not crossing, and that's we don't cross our religious boundaries by teaching and by facilitating. It's only what we have is to recognize that there are valid ways and theologically valid ways to reach to the divine, and mine might be, to me, is the most appropriate. To you, yours might be the most appropriate. Recognizing this will put us in a much better way than pushing our own on other people.
I'm just going to add that I think that is precisely why formation and education for chaplaincy is so important, and why you wouldn't just want to rely on volunteers in these capacities. Yeah. That I think there is an often unreflective approach to care that's offered by one that has not done the deep work that's involved in the formation for chaplaincy, and that unreflective action can often be more of what I would call an acquisitional strategy than a caregiving strategy. Yeah. It is trying to bring someone into my sense of meaning, my sense of purpose, rather than helping them reach deep into themselves, so that when I'm no longer there, because as a chaplain, rarely am I there for the long haul, then they are able to move back out and be more enriched within their own community than having to be dependent on mine.
Yeah. If I may, since we're talking about chaplaincy, I would like just for a minute introduce the Interreligious Chaplaincy at the Graduate Theological Union.
Of course.
Because if we're talking about the map for the U.S. where we are teaching chaplains, the overwhelming majority is taught from a Christian perspective.
Yeah. Yeah.
Welcoming of students of other faiths, and that's wonderful. But we are trying to do at the GTU as Interreligious Chaplaincy, where we have 3 centers, Islamic, Jewish, and Hindu studies, where students can get a master's. Out of these 3 centers came out the initiative of Interreligious Chaplaincy, where one will specialize in one of the 3 traditions, and then we offer a certificate of Interreligious Chaplaincy. What does that mean? Every course that we're teaching, for example, take ethics, will introduce ethics from the theories that are taught everywhere, but also we look at what Hindu ethics look like, what Islamic ethics look like, what Jewish ethics look like. So chaplains, when they finish the certificate, they will have their own tradition, plus they have been trained in the 3 traditions, so that will give them more advantage in terms of employability and looking at care for minorities as well, at the time when we have shortage of faith leaders who will care or offer care outside of their own congregations in hospitals, who are from Islamic perspective, or Muslims who are Hindu.
Right. And I know that the Interreligious Chaplaincy program is relatively new. As people are going through this program, where are they going to end up, or where have they ended up?
Well, we don't have any students yet. The students will be coming in September. And what we hope for is they will be working in all the fields of chaplaincy, in all chaplaincy settings. And for me, as a former healthcare chaplain, is to look at the needs and to build that volunteer program that Trace was talking about, led by, for example, a Hindu chaplain, and establish the Hindu volunteer chaplaincy. So it will be a chaplain-led and volunteer work together, but also operating in care for all patients as well.
One way to sort of pick up, and I know we're getting a little bit short on time, so we won't go over, but what we've been talking about the past couple of minutes involves sort of accompanying people, primarily patients in this conversation, but accompanying people more deeply into their own tradition in whatever way the chaplain is able to do that. We had this great question about how chaplains can help people who are experiencing some sort of religious, spiritual, philosophical, whatever struggle, especially if the tradition they're coming out of discourages that. If, questioning your faith is a sign of insufficient faith or whatever, what's the chaplain's role in that encounter? And especially in a healthcare situation, I'm sure this comes up all the time, but if you're the type of person that has grown to think that if you are good and pray enough that you will be healthy, and suddenly you are not healthy and now you struggle, what's the chaplain do in that situation, and how can they be educated to help?
That's a great question, and
Go ahead,
that's
Chaplain.
one of the urges to solve that. Is this literally a provider driven, or it's a patient driven? So for us as a chaplain, the first one is to verify literally the discomfort with the question: is this your own? You're struggling with that, or is this literally a patient? So if someone tells me I'm angry with God, I will be personally hurt by having this approach, but it's not about me at this point. It's about where that patient is. So literally, to meet someone where that person is, meaning we have to go through our own belief, our own priorities, and temporarily to suspend that, which is suspending the judgment in this case, and to look at the patient and understanding what their needs are. So if a patient in this case can I as a Muslim take care of without labeling an atheist who does not believe in God? Of course I can. By looking at what their whole purpose in life and meaning in life and what brings them joy and what hurts them, and that is a great entry to that. We don't need to talk about God if that is not important to that person.
Well, this last question that has just come in is a perfect way to end. This person wants to know more about where CPE is taking place, and I think the answer is no. Is there a centralized website we can learn more about different models and implementation in different countries? This is a known need. So I think the answer is no, but where can people go to learn more about everything that we have just discussed?
Well, for the Muslim communities, the website is Ziyara, ZIYARA.org, or if you Google Muslim Spiritual Care, it will come up. And I think TRACE is the Association for Clinical Pastoral Education, ACPE.edu. Is it .edu or .org?
EDU.
Thank you. So I think you can email us directly, and Michael, we can later on share with the participants our presentation as well as our contact information. We'll be more than happy to field any questions after that.
Fantastic.
We do have, ACPE has what we call full reciprocity, which means we fully recognize the CPE and they recognize ours in Canada and in Norway, which has a whole lot to do with upper Midwestern Lutherans, but that's a longer story. We are in conversation with Australia, New Zealand. We hope to be in conversation with South Africa. We continue to be in partnership with Hong Kong. So there are a number of places where there is some recognition that's available. We are almost done with full recognition with Ireland. But most CPE programs are nationally based. So a nation would have a CPE program. There are some where there's more than one national program. So there's more than one in Australia. There's more than one in Malaysia. And we're here to try to help you make decisions that hopefully will serve you best as you're discerning your career and where you might go next. So feel free to contact ACPE. We have an international relations committee and folks who represent a number of these different countries who can help with some of those questions too.
Wonderful. Well, we are right here at 2 o'clock, so we want everyone to be able to get back to their work day. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Trace. Thank you, Kamal, for being with us. This is one of those topics that it's not dated. This is only going to become more important as time goes on. And I think we all needed a break from the big C word that's on everyone's mind all day, every day. So thank you both for providing that. Thank you all. This is recorded. If you came late, you'll get a recording of it later, so no worries there. It will be on the website of the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab permanently. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon.